The afternoon sun spilled through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room where Frank and Eleanor Wilson sat surrounded by their loved ones. Balloons and streamers hung from the ceiling, and a large cake with 60 years together written in blue frosting sat on the coffee table. Their children, grandchildren, and even 3 great-grandchildren had gathered in their modest home to celebrate 6 decades of marriage. Frank, with his thinning white hair and gentle smile, kept glancing at Eleanor across the room. Even at 83, his eyes lit up whenever they found her, just like they did when they first met back in 1963. Eleanor, dressed in her favorite blue dress with her silver hair neatly pinned back, was showing their youngest great-grandchild how to fold a paper crane, something she had learned as a young woman. "Tell us the story again, Grandpa," asked their 10-year-old granddaughter Lily, plopping down next to Frank on the worn sofa that had been in their living room for nearly 30 years. Frank chuckled, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Which one, sweetheart?" "The one about how you met Grandma," Lily said, even though she had heard the story countless times. Eleanor looked up from her paper folding and shook her head with a smile. "Oh, Frank, don't bore the children with that old tale again." "Nonsense," their oldest son Richard called from across the room. "It's a family tradition now." Frank cleared his throat and leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window as if he could see into the past. "Well, it was a rainy Tuesday in April. I was working at my father's hardware store, and this pretty young lady came in looking for a particular kind of screw for a bookshelf she was fixing, and he couldn't stop staring at me." Eleanor added with a laugh. "Can you blame me?" Frank winked at her. "I nearly gave her the wrong screws 3 times because I couldn't focus. Finally, I got up the nerve to ask if I could come by and help her put up that bookshelf, and the rest, as they say, is history. Their home in Pine Creek, Minnesota wasn't large or fancy, but every inch of it told the story of their life together. The walls were lined with framed photographs, their wedding day, Frank in his National Guard uniform, Eleanor holding their firstborn, family camping trips, graduations, weddings, and countless Christmases and birthdays. After the celebration wound down and the last of their family members had left with hugs and promises to visit again soon, Frank found Eleanor sitting on their back porch watching the sunset. He lowered himself carefully into the chair beside her, his joints aching more than he liked to admit. "Quite a day," he said, reaching over to take her hand. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still on the horizon. 60 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were just starting out in that tiny apartment. Remember how the roof leaked right over the bed?" Frank laughed. "And you built that funny contraption with a tarp and a bucket." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "We didn't have much, but we had everything we needed." Frank squeezed her hand. "We still do." But as he looked at his wife's face, he noticed something he'd been seeing more often lately. A distant look in her eyes, as if part of her was somewhere else. It had started a few months ago, around the same time her health began to decline. The doctor had called it congestive heart failure. A common condition at her age, he'd said, prescribing medications and suggesting lifestyle changes. Frank had taken on more of the household chores as Eleanor's energy waned, but it was the change in her demeanor that worried him most. Later that night, as they got ready for bed in the routine they'd perfected over decades, Frank noticed Eleanor taking longer in the bathroom than usual. When she finally came out, her face looked pale. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just tired from all the excitement," she replied, climbing into her side of the bed they'd bought 20 years ago when their old one finally gave out. Frank turned off the lamp and settled in beside her. In the darkness, he could feel her restlessness. After nearly an hour of pretending to sleep, he heard Eleanor sigh and sit up. Through half-closed eyes, he watched as she opened the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out something small. It was a locket, an old silver one on a thin chain. Frank had seen it before, of course. Eleanor had always said it was a gift from her grandmother. But in all their years together, he realized he'd never seen her open it. Now, in the dim light filtering through the curtains, she held it tightly in her palm, not opening it, just clutching it as if it might try to escape. A tear slid down her cheek. Catching the moonlight, Frank almost spoke up then, almost asked what was wrong, but something stopped him. There was an intimacy to her sorrow that felt private even from him. So he lay still, pretending to sleep, as Eleanor eventually put the locket away and settled back down. The next morning, Frank woke to find Eleanor's side of the bed empty, He found her in the kitchen, already dressed and making breakfast as if nothing had happened. "Morning, sunshine," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Pancakes?" Frank nodded, watching her move around the kitchen with a familiarity born of decades in the same space. She seemed normal now, the Eleanor he knew, the woman who had stood beside him through raising 3 children, weathering financial hardships, celebrating triumphs both big and small. But something had shifted, like the first small crack in a foundation that had stood solid for 60 years. Over the next few weeks, Frank began to notice other things. Eleanor would take phone calls in the other room, speaking in hushed tones. She started checking the mail before he could get to it. Once he found her looking through an old photo album he'd never seen before, which she quickly put away when she heard him coming. Their oldest daughter, Patricia, came by one afternoon to drop off some groceries. While Eleanor was resting, Frank pulled Patricia aside. "Have you noticed anything different about your mother lately?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Patricia looked toward the bedroom where Eleanor was napping. "She seems more tired, but that's to be expected with her heart condition, isn't it?" Frank nodded slowly. "It's not just that. She seems worried about something. Secretive." "Mom? Secretive?" Patricia laughed softly. "Dad, this is the woman who tells the checkout clerk her entire medical history. She's an open book." Frank didn't argue, but the unease lingered. That night he woke around 2 in the morning to find Eleanor gone again. He found her in the living room, sitting in the dark, looking at old letters by the light of a small flashlight. When she saw him, she quickly gathered the papers and stuffed them back into an envelope. "Can't sleep?" he asked casually, as if he hadn't noticed her hurried movements. "Just some old correspondence from my cousin Doris," Eleanor said. "Nothing interesting." Frank didn't remember Eleanor ever mentioning a cousin named Doris. As May turned to June, Eleanor's health took a sharper decline. She tired more easily and had trouble catching her breath. The doctor adjusted her medications, but the improvements were minimal. Frank found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, trying to piece together the mystery that seemed to be growing between them. One night, he woke to the sound of Eleanor coughing. He helped her sit up and got her water, holding her hand until the coughing subsided. "Frank," she said, her voice raspy in the darkness, "if anything happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen," he interrupted, not wanting to hear whatever came next. Eleanor sighed. "We both know that's not true. When it does, I need you to look in the blue hat box in the back of my closet. There's something you should know." "Eleanor, you're scaring me," Frank said, turning on the bedside lamp to see her face better. In the soft light, she looked older and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. She reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. 60 years is a long time to keep a secret," she whispered. Before Frank could ask what she meant, another coughing fit seized her, worse than before. This time, when it subsided, she was too exhausted to talk anymore. Frank sat beside her until she fell asleep, his mind racing with questions. In 60 years of marriage, he'd thought he knew everything about Eleanor Wilson. Now, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she slept, he wondered if he had ever really known her at all. And the locket, the silver locket she never opened, seemed to hold the key to whatever secret lay between them. As summer settled over Pine Creek, the days grew longer and warmer. But Eleanor seemed to be fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. Frank watched helplessly as her once steady hands trembled when she tried to knit, an activity that had always brought her joy. Her appetite diminished, and the doctor added another pill to her growing collection of medications. One humid July afternoon, Frank returned from the grocery store to find Eleanor on the phone. Her back was turned to him as she spoke in hushed tones. "I understand, but he can't know yet. Not until—" She stopped abruptly when she heard Frank set the bags on the counter. "I have to go," she whispered into the receiver before hanging up. She turned to face him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Did you remember the strawberry jam?" Frank held up the jar. "Right here." "Who were you talking to?" "Oh, just Patricia about her visit next weekend," Eleanor said, busying herself with unpacking the groceries. Later that day, Frank called their daughter. "Patricia mentioned your phone call earlier," he said casually. There was a pause on the line. "What phone call, Dad?" "I haven't spoken to Mom since Sunday." Frank's stomach tightened. In 60 years, Eleanor had never lied to him, not about anything that mattered. Now she was spinning a web of small untruths, and he couldn't understand why. That night he woke to find Eleanor's side of the bed empty again. The digital clock on his nightstand read 1:47 a.m. He pulled on his robe and shuffled down the hallway. Following the faint smell of smoke to the living room, Eleanor was kneeling in front of the fireplace, feeding what looked like old papers into the small flames. The silver locket hung outside her nightgown, catching the firelight. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway, watching as she tore up what appeared to be a letter and tossed the pieces into the fire. "Eleanor," he said softly. She jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Frank, you scared me half to death. What are you burning?" Eleanor looked at the fire, then back at him. "Just clearing out some clutter. Old receipts and such. No sense keeping all this paper around." Frank stepped closer, catching sight of what looked like handwriting on one of the scraps before it curled and blackened in the flames. "At 2 a.m? "I couldn't sleep," she said, standing up slowly, one hand on the mantel for support. "The doctor said I should try to be more active when I'm feeling up to it. I thought I'd do a bit of cleaning." It was a reasonable explanation, but Frank didn't believe it. Not anymore. As he helped Eleanor back to bed, he noticed how the locket disappeared beneath her nightgown, hidden away like the truth she wasn't telling him. The next day, Patricia came by to help with some housework. While Eleanor rested, Frank pulled his daughter aside. "Your mother's been acting strange lately," he said, keeping his voice low, "making secret phone calls, burning papers in the middle of the night. And there's this locket she keeps holding on to like it's some kind of lifeline." Patricia frowned. "Maybe it's just the medication, Dad. Sometimes they can cause confusion or mood changes." "It's not that," Frank insisted. "She's hiding something. She mentioned a blue hat box in her closet. Said there was something I needed to know if anything happened to her. Have you looked inside it?" Frank shook his head. "It feels wrong to go behind her back. We've never kept secrets from each other." Patricia placed a hand on his arm. "Then maybe you should just ask her directly." But when Frank tried later that evening, Eleanor brushed off his concerns. "You're imagining things," she said with a weak laugh. "It's just this old heart of mine making me sentimental." The next week, their youngest son Thomas came to visit with his wife and children. Eleanor seemed to rally, her energy returning as she baked cookies with her grandchildren and listened to their stories about school and friends. For a few days, Frank almost believed things were back to normal. Then Thomas took him aside after dinner one evening. "Dad, I'm a little concerned," he said. His voice hushed as they stood in the garage where Frank still kept his woodworking tools, though he rarely used them these days. "I was helping Mom with her online banking yesterday. She wanted to send a gift to Lily for her dance recital. And I noticed something odd." Frank leaned against his workbench. "What kind of odd?" "There have been several large withdrawals from your savings account over the past year. About $40,000 in total." The news hit Frank like a physical blow. Their savings weren't enormous, but they'd been careful all their lives, putting away what they could for emergencies and to leave something for the kids. "That can't be right," Frank said, though he knew Thomas wouldn't make a mistake about something like this. "I asked Mom about it," Thomas continued. "She got flustered and said it was for medical expenses, but Dad, your insurance should cover most of that." Frank thought of the secret phone calls, the burning letters, and now missing money. What was Eleanor involved in? Was someone taking advantage of her? Blackmailing her somehow? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Frank confronted Eleanor as she sat at her vanity, brushing her thinning silver hair. "Ellie," he said, using the nickname from their younger days. "Thomas told me about the money, $40,000 from our savings." "What's going on?" Eleanor's brush paused mid-stroke. In the mirror, her eyes met his, filled with something that looked like fear. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "Then what is it? Because right now I'm thinking all sorts of things, none of them good." Frank sat on the edge of the bed. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Is someone pressuring you?" Eleanor set down her brush and turned to face him. "No, nothing like that. It's complicated." "We've handled complicated before," Frank said, reaching for her hands. They felt small and fragile in his. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. That's what we've always done." For a moment, it seemed like Eleanor might finally open up. She took a deep breath, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing it. Then something closed off in her expression. It's nothing for you to worry about, she said, squeezing his hands before pulling away. Just some arrangements I'm making. For after. After what? You know what the doctor said about my heart, Frank. I'm just being practical. Frank felt a chill run through him. $40,000 isn't being practical, Eleanor. That's more than we spent on Thomas's entire college education. Eleanor turned back to the mirror, picking up her brush again. I'm tired, Frank. Can we please talk about this another time? But another time never seemed to come. As August turned to September, Eleanor grew more withdrawn. She stopped making those secret phone calls, or perhaps became more careful about when she made them. The locket remained her constant companion, though she never opened it in Frank's presence. One evening, Patricia called with news that she'd be bringing her family for a visit that weekend. That's wonderful, dear, Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. We'll be so happy to see you. After she hung up, she turned to Frank with a determined look. I need to go to the bank tomorrow. What for? Frank asked, instantly suspicious. We should have some cash in the house for groceries and such, Eleanor said. With the family coming, we'll need extra supplies. Frank didn't argue, but the next day he insisted on driving her to the bank himself. He waited in the car while she went inside, watching through the glass doors as she spoke with a teller. 20 minutes later, she emerged with a large envelope that she quickly tucked into her purse. Everything okay? He asked as she settled into the passenger seat. Just fine, she said, patting her purse. Let's stop by the grocery store on the way home. Frank watched her throughout the shopping trip. She seemed almost energized, moving through the aisles with more vigor than she'd shown in weeks. She added extra treats to the cart. Thomas's favorite cookies, Patricia's preferred coffee, special cereals for the grandkids. You're in a good mood, he observed as they loaded the groceries into the trunk. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone. That night, Frank woke to find Eleanor sitting up in bed looking at something in her lap. It was an old photograph he'd never seen before, a young man in what looked like a military uniform from the 1950s. When she noticed him stirring, she quickly slipped it back into the ever-present locket. Who is that? Frank asked, his voice rough with sleep. In the dim light, he could see Eleanor's face go pale. No one you know, she said after a long moment. Just an old memory. Frank sat up, fully awake now. Eleanor, enough. What aren't you telling me? She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Please, Frank, not yet. I promise I'll explain everything soon. I just need a little more time. Time for what? He pressed. Eleanor reached for his hand. To find the right words. To make sure everything is in order. In order for what? Frank felt a surge of frustration. Eleanor, we've been married for 60 years. There's nothing you can't tell me. She looked down at their joined hands. Even the things that might change how you see me? How you feel about our whole life together? Before Frank could respond, Eleanor was seized by a coughing fit, worse than any he'd seen before. He helped her sit up, held her water glass, and eventually called an ambulance when the coughing wouldn't stop. That night in the hospital, as Eleanor slept with oxygen tubes in her nose and monitors beeping steadily beside her, Frank sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and wondered what secret could be so terrible that it threatened 60 years of love and trust. Eleanor returned home from the hospital after 3 days. The doctor had adjusted her medications again and recommended she rest as much as possible. Frank moved her favorite armchair next to the living room window so she could watch the birds at the feeder he'd hung years ago. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, painting their yard in shades of gold and red. Beautiful, isn't it? Frank said, bringing her a cup of tea one afternoon in early October. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on something distant beyond the yard. I always loved fall, she said softly. Do you remember our first apartment? The maple tree outside the bedroom window? How could I forget? You insisted we keep the curtains open even though the neighbors could probably see right in. Frank smiled at the memory. You said you didn't want to miss a single day of those red leaves. I wanted to soak up every beautiful moment, Eleanor said, her voice wistful. I never took any of it for granted, Frank, not a single day. Something in her tone made Frank's chest tighten. He sat on the footstool beside her chair and took her hand. Eleanor, please tell me what's going on. Whatever it is, we can face it together. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes filling with tears. I've tried so many times to tell you, but I'm afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid that when you know the truth, you'll look at our whole life together differently. A tear slipped down her cheek. And I couldn't bear that, Frank. Not after all these years. Frank wiped away her tear with his thumb. Nothing could change how I feel about you or our life together. Nothing. Eleanor looked as if she might finally open up, but the moment was interrupted by the doorbell. Frank sighed and patted her hand. Hold that thought. He wasn't expecting anyone. Patricia had visited the previous weekend and Thomas wasn't due until Thanksgiving. He opened the front door to find a tall, distinguished-looking elderly man standing on their porch. The stranger wore an expensive-looking gray suit and leaned slightly on a polished wooden cane. Despite his obvious age, Frank guessed he was in his early 80s. He stood remarkably straight, with an air of authority that reminded Frank of the military officers he'd known during his brief service decades ago. "Can I help you?" Frank asked. The man studied Frank's face for a moment before speaking. "I'm looking for Eleanor Wilson. I believe this is her residence." Frank felt a flicker of unease. "Yes, she's my wife." "And you are?" "My name is Howard Blackwood," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm an old acquaintance of your wife's." Frank shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip. "I don't recall Eleanor ever mentioning you." Something that might have been sadness passed across Howard's face. "No, I don't suppose she would have." Frank hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. Eleanor was in a fragile state, and this stranger's appearance felt connected to whatever secret she'd been keeping. But curiosity won out. "Come in, Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor is in the living room." Frank led the visitor through their modest entryway. As they approached the living room, he called out, "Eleanor, there's someone here to see you." A Mr. Howard Blackwood. From his position, Frank could see Eleanor's reaction. Her teacup clattered onto its saucer, and all the color drained from her face. She gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Howard stepped into the room, and for a long moment, the two elderly people simply stared at each other. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken words. "Hello, Eleanor," Howard finally said, his voice gentler than before. "It's been a long time." Eleanor's hand went to her throat where the silver locket lay hidden beneath her cardigan. "Howard," she whispered. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "You covered your tracks well, but some things can't stay buried forever." Frank looked between them, confusion and concern mounting. "Eleanor, who is this man?" Eleanor seemed to remember Frank's presence with a start. She turned to him with pleading eyes. "Frank, would you mind giving us a few minutes alone, please?" In 60 years of marriage, Eleanor had never asked him to leave her alone with another person in their home. The request stung, but the desperation in her voice was impossible to ignore. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," he said, giving Howard a warning look before reluctantly leaving the room. In the kitchen, Frank poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He could hear the murmur of voices from the living room but couldn't make out the words. Several times he heard Eleanor's voice rise in what sounded like distress, followed by Howard's deeper tones offering some kind of reassurance. Frank paced the small kitchen, checking his watch every few minutes. 5 minutes passed, then 10. After 15 minutes, he couldn't stand it anymore. He was about to return to the living room when he heard a sound that stopped him cold. Eleanor sobbing. Frank hurried back to the living room to find Eleanor with her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Howard stood by the window, his back to the room, his posture rigid. "What's going on here?" Frank demanded, rushing to Eleanor's side. "What have you said to upset her?" Howard turned, and Frank was surprised to see that the older man's eyes were also wet with tears. "I didn't come here to cause pain," he said quietly. "But some conversations are difficult, no matter how necessary they may be." Eleanor looked up, her face streaked with tears. "It's all right, Frank. Howard hasn't done anything wrong." "Then why are you crying?" Frank asked, kneeling beside her chair despite the protest from his arthritic knee. Eleanor took a shuddering breath. "Because the past has finally caught up with me." Howard stepped forward. "I should go. You two have things to discuss." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the coffee table. "My hotel information is on there. I'll be in town for 3 more days." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for coming, Howard. And for understanding. He would have wanted me to," Howard said cryptically. He turned to Frank and offered his hand again. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wilson. You seem like a good man." Frank shook his hand automatically, still confused by the entire exchange. "I'll see you out." At the door, Howard paused. "She loves you very much, you know. That much is clear to me, even after all these years." Before Frank could respond, Howard was walking down the path to a sleek black car parked at the curb. Frank watched as the stranger who had upset his wife's world drove away, then slowly returned to the living room. Eleanor had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes were still red. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Frank had ever seen her. "Who was that man, Eleanor?" Frank asked, sitting across from her. Eleanor touched the locket at her throat. "Howard Blackwood is my brother-in-law." Frank stared at her. "Your brother-in-law? But you don't have a sister or brother who married." "Not from my side of the family," Eleanor said softly. The implication took a moment to sink in. "You mean he was your husband's brother?" "But I'm your husband." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of secrets. "Before you, Frank. Before I came to Minnesota. Before I became Eleanor Henderson and then Eleanor Wilson." Frank felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. "You were married before? To his brother?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "His name was William Blackwood. Billy, I called him. We were married in 1952, just after he enlisted." 1952? Frank's mind raced. "But you never... In 60 years, you never once mentioned being married before." "Because as far as the world was concerned, that woman no longer existed," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She died along with her husband in 1953. Frank leaned back in his chair, trying to process this revelation. "William died. He was reported missing in action during the Korean War," Eleanor explained, her fingers working nervously at the edge of her cardigan. "His body was never recovered. I was told he was presumed dead. And you never told me?" Frank couldn't keep the hurt from his voice. "All these years you let me believe I was your first and only husband?" "I wanted to tell you so many times," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face again. "In the beginning, the pain was too fresh. Then as time went on, it seemed harder and harder to bring it up. How do you tell someone you've built a life with that you've been keeping such a secret?" Frank stood up and walked to the window, needing space to think. Outside, the wind was picking up, sending leaves swirling across their lawn. Just like his thoughts, scattered and chaotic. "So this Howard, he tracked you down after all these years. Why now?" Eleanor's hands went to the locket. With trembling fingers, she opened it for the first time in Frank's presence. Inside was the photograph he had glimpsed weeks before. A young man in uniform with a confident smile and eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. "This is Billy," she said, holding it out to Frank. "Howard has been looking for me since he discovered some old papers of Billy's a few years ago. Papers that suggested his brother might have been involved in something complicated during the war." Frank took the locket, studying the face of the man who had been Eleanor's first love. There was a resemblance to Howard, the same straight nose and strong jawline. "What kind of complicated?" he asked, handing the locket back. Eleanor closed it carefully. "That's what Howard came to tell me. And it changes everything, Frank. Everything." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, marking the hour. Outside, the golden afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room. Frank sat back down, his heart heavy with the weight of this new reality. "Tell me everything," he said. "No more secrets, Eleanor. It's time for the truth." Night had fallen outside the Wilson home. Frank made coffee, something he rarely did in the evening, sensing they would both need it for the conversation ahead. Eleanor sat on the couch, a photo album Frank had never seen before open on her lap. He set the mugs on the coffee table and sat beside her, close but not touching. "Where did that come from?" he asked, nodding at the album. "The blue hat box," Eleanor replied. "I've kept it hidden all these years." Frank looked at the page she had opened. It showed a young woman in a white dress standing beside the uniformed man from the locket. They were cutting a small wedding cake, both laughing at something off camera. "Is that you?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. The young woman had Eleanor's smile, her way of tilting her head slightly to one side. "That was my wedding day. April 12th, 1952. Eleanor touched the photo gently. "I was Grace then." "Grace Lawson. That's my real name, Frank. The name I was born with." Frank tried to wrap his mind around this revelation, the woman he'd loved for 60 years, the mother of his children. Wasn't even who she claimed to be. Grace, he repeated, testing the name. It felt foreign on his tongue, like it belonged to a stranger. Eleanor, or Grace, nodded. I haven't heard anyone call me that in so long. How did you become Eleanor? She turned the page of the album. More photos of the young couple, at a lakeside in front of a small house with groups of friends. After Billy was reported missing, I was devastated. We'd only been married 11 months. I was 22 years old, waiting for a husband who would never come home. Her voice quavered but remained steady. The official telegram said he was missing in action, presumed dead. No body was ever recovered. Frank remembered how young people looked at the world back then, how a tragedy like that would seem like the end of everything. That must have been terrible for you. It was, Eleanor admitted. I couldn't stay in our apartment surrounded by his things, the life we'd planned together. Everyone looked at me with such pity. Poor Grace, they'd whisper. Such a tragedy for one so young. She shook her head at the memory. After 6 months, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed what I could carry, took my savings, and just left. Where did you go? I had an aunt in Chicago who died a few years earlier. Eleanor Henderson was her name. I remembered she had a birth certificate in her papers that my mother had kept. Eleanor had no children, no one to carry on her name. So I took it. She looked up at Frank, her eyes pleading for understanding. I became Eleanor Henderson. I dyed my hair, changed how I dressed. I got a job as a secretary and started over. Frank tried to imagine the desperation that would drive someone to completely abandon their identity. And then you moved to Minnesota? Eleanor nodded. After about a year in Chicago, I was afraid someone might recognize me or ask too many questions. I saw an advertisement for a job in Pine Creek and thought a small town might be the perfect place to truly disappear. Where you met me, Frank said, remembering the hardware store, the pretty young woman looking for screws for a bookshelf. Yes. Eleanor's eyes softened. I never planned to fall in love again, Frank, but you were so kind, so persistent. A small smile touched her lips. You kept finding reasons to stop by my apartment to check on that bookshelf. Despite everything, Frank felt himself smiling too. It was the most inspected bookshelf in Minnesota. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of their early days together. But why keep it a secret all these years? Frank finally asked. After we were married, after the children came along, why not tell me the truth? Eleanor closed the photo album and set it aside. At first I was afraid. What I did wasn't exactly legal, Frank. Taking someone else's identity, even a dead relative's. And I was afraid you might look at me differently if you knew I'd been married before. I wouldn't have cared about that. Maybe not. But then more time passed, and the longer I kept the secret, the harder it became to tell. How do you explain to your husband of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that you've been lying about who you are from the very beginning? Her hand went to the locket, and there was a part of me that wanted to protect Billy's memory too. Talking about him made it real that he was gone. Frank understood that feeling. There were memories of his time in the service that he rarely spoke about. Losses that were easier to bear when left undisturbed. So what changed? He asked. Why is Howard looking for you now after all this time? Eleanor took a deep breath. That's where things get complicated. Howard found some of Billy's personal effects in their mother's attic after she died a few years ago. Among them were letters and documents that suggested Billy wasn't just a regular soldier. Frank leaned forward. What do you mean? According to Howard, Billy was involved in intelligence work. Classified operations that even Howard doesn't fully understand. Eleanor's hands twisted nervously in her lap. But what he does know is that Billy wasn't actually declared dead when I was told he was. What? Frank's confusion deepened. But you said you received an official telegram. I did. But Howard found military records indicating Billy was listed as on assignment for nearly 2 years after I was notified of his presumed death. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. Frank, I think the government deliberately misled me. Frank tried to process this information. Why would they do that? Howard believes it was related to whatever classified work Billy was doing. Maybe they needed everyone, even his wife, to believe he was dead. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. But the most painful part is that the records show Billy actually did die. 2 years later, in 1955, by then, I was already living here in Pine Creek. I had already met you. The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the air between them. Frank tried to imagine how differently things might have turned out if Eleanor, Grace, had known her first husband was still alive during those early days of their courtship. "There's more," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "After I left, apparently the military set up a pension for Billy's widow. It was substantial given the classified nature of his work. That money has been accumulating in an account all these years with regular cost of living increases." Frank remembered the large withdrawals Thomas had discovered. "The money you've been taking from our savings?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not exactly. When Howard first contacted me 6 months ago, he told me about the pension. He helped me claim it, using my original identity documents that I'd kept hidden all these years. The government required extensive verification, which is why I've been making those mysterious phone calls and burning old papers that might raise questions." "So the withdrawals from our account?" "I was moving our savings to a new account," Eleanor explained. "In both our names, but with a different bank. I was afraid that once I claimed the pension under my real name, it might somehow trigger an investigation into identity fraud. I didn't want our life savings to be tied up if that happened." Frank felt a wave of relief that at least their money wasn't gone, followed immediately by renewed concern. "Could you still get in trouble for this? After all these years?" "Howard doesn't think so. The statute of limitations has long passed for identity fraud, especially since I used a deceased relative's name and didn't harm anyone. And the military seems more concerned with keeping Billy's work secret than prosecuting his elderly widow." Eleanor reached for Frank's hand. "But I've been terrified, Frank. Not of legal consequences, but of losing you when you found out I've been living a lie for 60 years. Frank looked down at their joined hands, wrinkled, spotted with age but still strong together. 6 decades of memories flashed through his mind. Eleanor holding their firstborn son, teaching Patricia to bake cookies, dancing with him on their 25th anniversary, tending her garden, laughing at his jokes even when they weren't funny. Whatever name she had been born with, this was the woman he had built a life with. "You're not living a lie," he said finally. "Maybe you started with a different name, but everything that matters has been real. Our love, our family, our life together, none of that is a lie." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "You don't hate me for deceiving you all these years?" Frank shook his head. "I could never hate you. I'm hurt that you didn't trust me with the truth sooner, but I understand why it was hard to tell me." He squeezed her hand. "We all have parts of our past we'd rather leave behind." Eleanor wiped away her tears with her free hand. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said. "The pension money, it's substantial. Over $1 million with all the interest it's accrued." Frank's eyebrows shot up. $1 million? "I've set up a trust with most of it for the children and grandchildren," Eleanor explained. "But I've kept aside enough to make sure you're taken care of after—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. Her health was failing, and they both knew she likely didn't have much time left. The money Howard mentioned today, he's discovered that there may be additional compensation due to Billy's family because of the nature of his work and how his death was handled. He thinks I might be entitled to it as his legal widow. Frank nodded slowly, processing everything. "So that's why you've been withdrawing cash recently? For Howard to help with this claim?" "No," Eleanor said, looking down. "The cash was for something else. I needed to pay a private investigator to look into something for me, and I didn't want to leave a paper trail." "A private investigator? For what?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "To find out if Billy had any living relatives besides Howard. Any children he might have had after they told me he was dead and before he actually died." Frank felt a chill run through him. "And did he?" Eleanor's eyes met his, filled with a lifetime of emotions. "That's what Howard came to tell me today, and that's why I need to tell you everything now before it's too late." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, but neither Frank nor Eleanor noticed. The coffee in their mugs had gone cold, forgotten, as Eleanor revealed the final pieces of her long-kept secret. Howard found out that during those 2 years when Billy was supposedly dead, but actually on some classified assignment, he was stationed in Japan. Eleanor's voice had grown hoarse from talking, but she pressed on. According to the records Howard discovered, Billy was working with military intelligence there, and he had a relationship with a local woman. Frank felt a strange mixture of emotions: sympathy for the young Grace who had been left behind, anger at the government's deception, and an odd sort of jealousy toward a man long dead. Did they have children? He asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the photo album between them. A daughter, born in 1954, about 6 months before Billy actually died. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. Her name is Michiko. She's 71 now. Frank tried to wrap his mind around this information. Does she know about you? No. According to Howard, she was raised by her mother and later her stepfather. She grew up believing her biological father was an American soldier who died before she was born. She wasn't told his name or anything about his family. Eleanor looked up at Frank. She lives in California now. She came to the United States for college in the 1970s and stayed. She's a retired professor of literature. And the private investigator you hired, was that to find her? Yes, Howard had a name and some old photographs, but he couldn't locate her. The investigator found her 2 weeks ago. Eleanor reached for her purse on the side table and pulled out an envelope. These are pictures of her. Of Michiko. Frank took the envelope with a strange sense of unreality. Inside were several photographs. A professional headshot of an elegant Asian American woman with graying hair, and several candid shots showing the same woman with what appeared to be her family. A husband, grown children and young grandchildren. She has a family, Frank said, studying the photos. Grandchildren. 3 children and 5 grandchildren, Eleanor confirmed. The investigator compiled a detailed report. She's had a good life, Frank. A full life. Frank looked at his wife of 60 years, seeing her in a completely new light. Have you contacted her? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know if I should. What right do I have to disrupt her life with this story? To tell her that everything she knows about her father is incomplete? She took a shuddering breath. And what would I even say? Hello. I'm the wife of your father from before he supposedly died, but actually didn't. Frank set the photos aside and took Eleanor's hands in his. They felt cold despite the warmth of the room. What do you want to do? I don't know, she whispered. Part of me wants to meet her, to tell her about Billy. The Billy I knew, the man who loved poetry and couldn't carry a tune and wanted to be an architect after the war. Her eyes filled with tears again. But another part of me is terrified. What if she hates me for abandoning him, even though I didn't know he was alive? What if she blames me for moving on, for building a new life with you? You didn't do anything wrong, Eleanor, Frank said firmly. You were told your husband was dead. You grieved him. You had every right to build a new life. Eleanor squeezed his hands. I've been so afraid of what you would think when you learned the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, of seeing disappointment or betrayal in your eyes after all these years. Frank looked at the woman before him, still beautiful to him despite the changes time had wrought, still the person who knew him better than anyone else in the world. I won't pretend I'm not shocked or that it doesn't hurt that you kept this from me for so long. But nothing changes how I feel about you or the life we've built together. Relief washed over Eleanor's face. Really? Really, Frank affirmed. Though I might need some time to get used to thinking of you as Grace. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. I haven't been Grace in so long I'm not sure I would answer to it anymore. Eleanor is who I am now, who I've been for most of my life. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both processing the enormity of the revelations. So what happens now? Frank finally asked. With Howard, with the pension money, with Michiko? Eleanor took a deep breath. Howard is helping me file the paperwork for the additional compensation. There shouldn't be any issues since I'm legally Billy's widow, even if I've been using a different name. As for the money that's already been collected, it's all set up in the trust for the children and grandchildren, with provisions for your care. She hesitated. And as for Michiko, I think I need to sleep on that decision. Frank nodded, understanding the weight of such a choice. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. That night they slept closer together than they had in years, Frank's arm protectively around Eleanor as if he could shield her from the ghosts of the past. In the morning, Eleanor seemed lighter somehow, as if unburdening herself of her secret had restored some of her vitality. Over breakfast, she said, I want to tell Patricia and Thomas the truth. They deserve to know. Frank agreed, and they called both children to arrange a family meeting for the following weekend. The days leading up to it were filled with quiet conversations as Frank asked questions about Eleanor's life as Grace, about Billy, about the young woman she had been before he knew her. Eleanor answered everything honestly, seeming relieved to finally share that part of herself. When their children arrived, Eleanor told them everything, showing them the photos and documents she had kept hidden for decades. Patricia and Thomas were stunned but ultimately understanding. "So we have a stepsister in California?" Thomas asked, examining the photos of Michiko and her family. "Half-sister, technically," Patricia corrected, "and she doesn't even know about us." "Not yet," Eleanor said quietly, "but I've decided I want to contact her. She deserves to know about her father, about his family." Frank squeezed her hand supportively. "We'll figure out the best way to approach her." With Howard's help, Eleanor composed a letter to Michiko, explaining everything as gently as possible, and including some photos of Billy that she had kept hidden all these years. She also included her phone number and address, making it clear that it was entirely Michiko's choice whether to respond. 2 weeks passed with no reply, and Eleanor tried to hide her disappointment. "It was probably too much to hope for," she told Frank one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "If I were in her position, I might not want to open that door either." The next day, while Eleanor was resting, the phone rang. Frank answered it, and a soft voice with a slight accent asked, "Is this the Wilson residence?" "I'm trying to reach Eleanor Wilson or Grace Lawson." Frank's heart raced. "Yes, this is the right number. May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Michiko Taylor. I received a letter about my father, William Blackwood." Frank called for Eleanor, who came to the phone with trembling hands. The conversation was brief but emotional, with arrangements made for a video call the following day so they could see each other face to face. That night, Eleanor could hardly sleep from nervous excitement. What if she asks why I never tried to find out what happened to Billy? What if she blames me for moving on so quickly? "You'll tell her the truth," Frank said simply. "That's all anyone can do." The video call the next day was awkward at first, with both women studying each other's faces for traces of the man they had both loved in different ways. But as they began to talk, Eleanor sharing stories of the young Billy before the war, Michiko asking questions about her father's childhood and dreams, the initial tension eased. "I have his letters," Michiko revealed, holding up a small bundle tied with ribbon. "My mother gave them to me when I was 18. He wrote to her regularly during those months they were together. He mentioned a wife back home who believed he was dead. He felt terrible about it, but said it was necessary for her safety and his mission." Eleanor covered her mouth, tears flowing freely. "He thought of me?" "He loved you very much," Michiko said gently. "He wrote that the hardest part of his assignment was knowing you were grieving unnecessarily, but he believed he was protecting you." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Michiko spoke regularly. Plans were made for Michiko and her husband to visit Minnesota in the spring. Eleanor also spoke with Howard several more times, learning more details about Billy's classified work and the circumstances of his actual death. A heart attack. Ironically, not combat-related at all. As Eleanor's health continued to decline, she found peace in finally reconciling the two halves of her life. She introduced Frank to Billy through stories and photographs, no longer hiding that part of herself. And Frank, though sometimes still startled by revelations about his wife's previous life, came to see the complete picture of the woman he loved. One evening, as they looked through old photo albums together, both Eleanor's hidden one and the family albums they had filled over 6 decades, Frank asked, "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a new identity, leaving your old life behind?" Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. "I regret the deception," she said finally. "I regret not trusting you with the truth sooner. But I can't regret the path that brought me to you, to our children, to this life we've built together." She touched his face gently. "I've been Eleanor Wilson far longer than I was ever Grace Lawson. This is who I am now, who I chose to become." In her final weeks, Eleanor found an unexpected peace. The weight of her secret had lifted, and with it much of her anxiety. She spent her remaining time surrounded by family, both old and newly discovered. Michiko arrived earlier than planned when Eleanor's condition worsened, bringing with her a lifetime of questions and a genuine desire to know the woman who had loved her father first. On a quiet Sunday morning in early December, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep, Frank's hand in hers. At her funeral, attended by children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors who had known her for decades, Howard Blackwood sat next to Michiko Taylor in the front row alongside Frank. When Frank stood to speak about his wife of 60 years, he looked out at the gathered mourners, at the family that had expanded in unexpected ways in those final months. Eleanor Wilson lived a life filled with love, he said, his voice steady despite his grief. She loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. Some might say she lived two lives, but I prefer to think she lived one extraordinary life with many chapters. He touched the silver locket that now hung around his neck, and I am grateful to have been her companion for so much of that journey. As he returned to his seat, Michiko squeezed his hand in understanding. Together, they would carry forward the complex, beautiful legacy of a woman who had loved two men, bridged two families, and ultimately found the courage to embrace her whole truth.